If you look at the Chinese central bank gold reserves, it didn't change for a long time, and they actually kept it secret. They were trying to, for a long time, push gold out to the people. You can find gold everywhere, every banking system, every bank, retail branch.
Please join us for our next live stream, Sunday, August 29th at 9 p.m. Eastern. We'll go over current events, past guests, and of course, gold and silver news. Once again, our next live stream will be Sunday, August 29th, 9 p.m. Eastern. See you then. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira. As always, if you are new to our channel or if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe, hit the bell to be notified on new updates, and give us a thumbs up if you like what we do. We truly do appreciate your support. Dan Collins joins us today. Dan Collins is a financial market analyst and the founder of Hippograph Data Security and associate at Heisenberg Capital. Dan is also a certified ethical hacker and has a 20-year engineering career in mainland China. It's time to saddle up and silver up for the very interesting Dan Collins. Dan, welcome to SBTV. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you. Good to be here.
Glad to have you on. I understand you're a very, very interesting fellow, so I'm glad to have some time to share with you. It is your first time here on SBTV, so if you don't mind, could you let our viewers know a little bit about your background?
Sure. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan area. Spent 20 years in China. Originally went to China as a grad student back in the late 90s. Was an executive in General Motors. My background's engineering. I've run factories, large divisions for Fortune 500. A few years ago, started my own businesses. I have a cybersecurity company, and I have a medical company as well, so medical distribution. So, I've been quite busy keeping, building businesses. I have a engineering tech background. A lot of geopolitical type stuff I'm interested in is one of my passions, and that's general background of my story.
Okay, we're missing one thing, Dan. What is an ethical hacker?
Ethical hackers are basically some of the guys I employ at one of my companies. Is that these guys are basically former black hats that become, we say black hats that become white hats. Guys that used to do, guys that would have previously hacking skills, but now they're on the good side trying to defend systems. My company Hippogriff, we do a lot of ransomware intervention type stuff, network modeling, all types of hardening customer systems. We have a couple partners that we do cloud care type stuff. So, ethical hackers are basically guys that work for IT defense companies that will come in, overview their system. We do what's called a threat model. So we'll go into customers, we hit their systems with, 10 or so different tools that kind of give them an idea where the issues are in their systems. And everybody's got them.
Okay, it's good to know you're one of the good guys. Always good to know that.
We try, but it's an arms race, as you can imagine. It's between the good guys and the bad guys. And I'd say the bad guys are winning right now, unfortunately.
All right, we got to change that around.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I can't help you there. You've lived in China for a good number of years. You've done business in China for a good number of years. Being an American who knows China perhaps better than most, what kept you in China so long, that 20 plus years, and what are some misconceptions of China?
Yeah, so China is obviously a giant country. It's 3-4 times the size of Europe in population, but geographically much larger. I went over originally as an exchange student. I was a student at Tsinghua University, which is kind of the MIT of China. It's still by far the number one technical university in China. I think it's top 10 in the world now rankings. Very amazing place. I went over, as I said, originally as an exchange student. I graduated there my last semester and went right to work for General Motors. General Motors China was just starting in China at the time. They sold 12,000 vehicles that year, the first year I started there, and they sell more than 3 million vehicles a year now. So I lived through the whole massive ramp up of the Chinese economy. It was pretty amazing time and place to be there, because you literally went from people having bicycles to people having regular cars to everyone in Shanghai driving Porsches and Mercedes. It was basically the largest economic and industrial boom the world has ever seen in such a short, condensed time. And I lived through that. I was there running factories every 6 months, build a new factory to keep up with the demand. So I kind of lived through the whole rise of China, so to speak. And I speak Chinese. I still have an apartment there, although I'm living now in Miami for the last 2 years. Um, Plan to go back, obviously, once COVID's over. But yeah, so that's how I got started in China, and some of my, I've got a million stories on China, obviously, from being there for so long.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into a few of those. Dan, what is the CCP's ideology as stated, and then again as reality as you lived there for quite a while?
Sure. So the CCP, you got to remember, started as really, 1949. Mao Zedong stood up at the top in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and said, "中国站起来了." So China has stood up. That was really the time. Kind of China looks back to the CCP was founded a few years before that. I think it was 1921. Yeah, they just celebrated their 100-year anniversary. But 1949, China really had consolidated. The CCP had consolidated control of the country, and it was in a really bad space. I mean, you have to remember, people don't understand what China was like. It was very feudal. China had lived thousands of years through feudalism, complete poverty, people were hungry. Before the CCP took control, it was basically warlords, and they would basically have people in servitude. I mean, you would owe taxes 60 years in advance. There's a lot of good, if anyone's interested, there's a lot of good literature on it. I'll pick up like books like Edward Snow. Snow at the time wrote a great book on the founding of the CCP. CCP then, as you follow through the time up till today, they had a lot of. It took them a long time to learn to manage 1.4 billion people. There was a lot of rough roads in from then to today. You had the Great Leap Forward, 30, 40 million people starved to death. Basically, natural calamity. It wasn't meant, but it happened. And then, but when really they kicked off was 1978. Deng Xiaoping came in. We don't care if the cat's black or white as long as it catches mice. That was the saying. They kind of reformed to a lot of private enterprise. They still kept a very strict control on the state-owned sides of the economy, and that continues to today. The banking system's nationalized, oil and gas is nationalized. They have a hybrid model where the state companies compete with each other and they compete with private enterprise. So post 78, post 90s up till today, the Chinese CCP has created a governance economic model that is just, I would say, taking the world by storm. You've never seen anything like this. A lot of people, if you've never been to China and you're getting all your information just on the propaganda out there, you have to go there at some time to actually see what's happened. I'm from Detroit. The place has been burned out. Most of the industrial areas of the United States have been burned out, and we've been deindustrialized in the U.S. We have got major problems, and for about 10 years or more than 10 years, I've been kind of highlighting China and holding it up as a mirror to the United States on what the United States needs to do to get back in the game economically. We're so far out of the game now that people, we're so far behind if we think we're ahead, and it's become to point critical at this point, I think, in terms of the U.S. in terms of turning their economy around.
Okay, before I move on, what do you think the U.S. needs to do to turn things around?
Sure. So it's tough to turn around at this stage. You're basically looking at the U.S. had 38% corporate tax. No, I lived through this whole time. U.S. had 38% corporate tax rate at one time, all types of rules, regulations, and everyone just left, basically. All the factories left. So, I mean, I saw it in China. You can start at the Shanghai airport and you can drive get past Shanghai, drive 3, 4, 5 hours, and it's factory after factory after factory. They set up special economic zones, no taxes for 3 years. Everything's focused on employment. So the CCP is they do, honestly, people might find it hard to believe, but they care about people. That's the number one thing. China's so competitive today because they came out of poverty. So the guys that are my age and older, they remember being hungry as children. So they're it's created a a system where that they're going to work and they're going to strive to create a better better economy. Over in the U.S., we've completely lost what creates jobs and economic growth and prosperity. We've been in a ever increasing cycle of money printing. Factories are gone. The good paying jobs are gone. Most of the economy is you work for the government or you're now in an Amazon warehouse selling, moving Chinese goods from point A to point B. So the economy is completely, if you look at the United States major export, it's soybeans. So how can you be a major global economic superpower and your major export is soybeans? The U.S. is completely uncompetitive on almost every type of modern consumer good. So what they need to do is you need to really start looking at what got you here in the first place. So highest corporate tax rate in the world, insane regulations. You need special economic zones to get in factories. So what you saw, say 4 years ago, when the Trump administration lowered the corporate tax rate down to 20%, you saw into a lot of these games where people are outsourcing everything and said, okay, we'll put a plant and equipment up in the U.S. because people will pay 20%, but at 40%, everyone games the system. So in the U.S., it's completely, and it was one of my shocking things when I started Fortune 500. I learned everybody games the system. You put the factory up in China, you put the corporate headquarters in Hong Kong, and you basically get a 0% tax because you run everything through Hong Kong. Apple has never paid more than 8% tax in the United States, but yet the corporate tax rate's officially, almost 30%. So you have to, the tax system has to be restructured. I mean, they basically, in the United States, we basically have to start thinking out of the box, go right back to the beginning, start to build everything that can possibly be built in the U.S., keeping in mind that obviously you want to follow free market principles, but the reality is there's no free market in the world. It doesn't exist. So China was built behind 45, 55% tariffs. Everything is a tariff. The customs houses will nag you about localizing things. The government will go to you and say, why are you importing this? Build it here. So the U.S. is basically, you can't be a nation of 330 million people like the U.S. is and not make anything. So that is, I've harped on this point for more than a decade, is that the manufacturing, everything around you is manufactured somehow. So they have to go back to being able to produce goods for themselves and stop relying on imports if they want to grow the economy.
Okay, all great points. So perhaps a little bit less red tape and a little bit less regulations. I mean, all of these points and how you mentioned that the competition in China is pretty fierce. Are these reasons why you've called China a capitalist country?
Yeah, it's like I said, it's a hybrid model. So some of the industries, for instance, the banking system is state owned. They run 4 or 5 very large banks that trickles down into commercial banks, which are some are private, but they do very strict lending. Like they basically only will lend to state owned companies, or if it's a private enterprise, it must be a secured loan. So you've got to back it up with an asset like a factory that you own. So they have a hybrid model. The private enterprises, though, in China are absolutely cutthroat, and that goes into every type of industry. That's why they've basically taken over the markets everywhere in the world. Some areas like solar panels, electric vehicles, the government has thrown so much money into that, and that's back to my point on free trade. There is no free trade. These companies are just awash in capital. Used to be steel, now it's solar panels, now it's electric vehicles. So these aren't free markets, but they're private enterprises that exist in the free market are so cutthroat that they are just so competitive. It's very, very difficult to compete against them. And they've created, China's been through a renaissance. Everybody's been working so hard for 20, 30 years. Like it's hard to explain. Like I would tell, when I was in the Fortune 500 companies, we would work 12-hour days. Just constantly. And then you go back to the U.S. headquarters and nothing's going on. It's just quiet. Everyone's out of the office at 3. So you can see the difference and China's been building this up. People, young students, they just had to stop the private tutor industry because kids will end up studying from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. So the society, it's gone through a renaissance, but it's very cutthroat in everything. There's a lot of competition, and that's why they're basically taking over world markets in most products.
Yeah, I guess we'd all have to recognize that they are putting in the work in China, definitely putting the work. Dan, you mentioned things like electric vehicles there. What types of other opportunities or sectors look to be high growth in China?
Yeah, so China they're positioning themselves. They're moving into that middle income area. They've already announced that. They plan for this year to be I think 40% of their economy of their people now are in what you'd call middle class. They're making at least $20,000 a year. That's up 10 times, in 10, 15 years. So really the opportunities in China now as it's positions it's already a very high tech economy in many ways. I mean, you're in Asia, you probably know this, but China is more advanced technically than the United States. The mobile payments market's 50 times the size of the United States. The the U.S. doesn't even have an app like a WeChat, which is an all-encompassing portal, can do everything on one, interface. As I mentioned, mobile payments, you're sending money, but in areas like artificial intelligence, China is now at least tied with the U.S., probably ahead of it. They have all the data. Quantum computing, they're putting in 10 times the investment the United States is. Basically, China started as in a catch-up phase. So let's learn how to make. When I moved to China in 1998, they couldn't make anything of decent quality. Honestly, it was like we basically, as an American multinational, we would set up the plants, and basically it was like a learning process, but they just took off over 20 years. They caught up on the kind of basic manufacturing type industries. Now they're moving more into the service, high tech. But basically, China, as big as it is, will be dominant in almost every sphere of the economy.
And sticking with the competition, how do businesses and the government in China, how do they deal with domestic copyright issues, domestic intellectual property laws, and things like that? Because the rest of the world seems to think like these things are overlooked, they're not important. But how does China deal with it internally and then externally with organizations like the World Trade Organization?
So on domestic copyright, it's been weak for years. So going back 20 years, uh, China honestly just didn't care. You can go there's markets. We used to say the fake DVD markets and the even now today online video. You can basically just Chinese website. You can find any movie you want for free. Um, DVD. These types of pirated software. At one time, I think 95% of Windows machines were pirated in China. It's gotten a little better over the years. They try to control it, but it's honestly not. You can negotiate with them over it, but their concept of copyright is so weak that they honestly just don't care, and you just try to get as far as you can with them on it. That is also it's led to a unique competitive advantage in our economy, especially in tech. So I'll explain that. What's happened is that let's say you're a startup, you come out with a product, you launch, the next day someone's copied you. And there's really nothing you can do about it. So you can't just rest on your laurels. It's not like in the US where you can go get a patent on something and you got 19 years to develop it. No, you launch your product, it's got to be continuously improved, add new features, add new distribution, new customers, new technology, because someone's copying you every day. So it's basically a gladiator's pit of business that you have to compete. And that's why so many of the Chinese companies are so competitive now.
And I mean, I can understand that internally within China, the competition and things like that. But when we go externally, global trade, and again, organizations like World Trade Organization, don't they have some type of governance over copyright issues, intellectual property issues?
Yeah, so these international organizations, and the U.S. has relied on these. They've largely been a failure. So up until even to this day, China's categorized as a developing economy, which means they can block their import markets, right? So if you're categorized as that's where the U.S. friction has come with the trade. They're dominating in the global trade space, yet they can block their own market because they're categorized as a developing economy. It's like you're landing rovers on the far side of the moon. You're leading the world in quantum and artificial intelligence, and yet you still try to play yourself off as a developing economy. I'm sorry, this doesn't work anymore. So the whole trade system has been lopsided, and a lot of times in their favor, because they're going to do what's best for them. They're going to ignore everything else. And not just them, but most of the Asian economies are what you call mercantilist. So Japan's not going to buy a Korean car. Korea's not going to buy a Japanese car. Neither one of them are going to buy a car from the US. They block their own markets. They try to export. It's kind of an Asian mentality that's been around for decades. And it's kind of left the U.S. with no markets internationally. And, it's basically at this point, we've kind of hit rock bottom in the U.S. in terms of manufacturing. We manufacture a third of our cars, and our car market in the United States this year will be about 12 million cars. China makes 30 million. So it's not even close anymore. China has just way surpassed the United States.
Yeah, I also understand that once upon a time, the biggest part of China's GDP was manufacturing, but today I understand it's consumption.
Yeah, it's slowly tilting the balance, into the service sector. They're trying to do that. Their labor's running out. It's been kind of running out for 10 years. It's kind of a shocker, actually, for someone like myself who's been in China 20 years. When we first were over in China, if you would have said China would run out of labor someday, people would have looked at you like you were crazy. Like we would make acquisition of parts companies in the company I was in, and they would have 700 workers, and they would need 100. So I mean that was this is going back to the late '90s, early 2000s. Fast forward 20 years, or even 15 years, you literally ran out of labor. You started to see the factory factories down in Guangzhou and Shenzhen area just run out of people. It's still happening to this day. The demographics in China, they're going to lose 100 million workers every decade, for the foreseeable future. So they're now switching into. You saw the robotics boom in China the last few years, like automation, robotics, anything to get rid of workers. Companies are trying to adopt, because obviously workers are, this expense on workers has gone up 10 times in a decade. So it used to be nothing. Like when you break down your cost models, labor would be 5% of your cost. Throw more labor at it, didn't matter. Now it's resembling more developed economy models where it's 30-40% of their cost. So they're just slashing labor, as fast as they can.
Okay, and China's leader Xi Jinping, as do all leaders, they make bold statements, truthful statements, sometimes a little bit of untruthful statements, peaceful statements, hopeful statements, and at times threatening statements. Again, all leaders do this. China's generals, its ministers, they have been known to lately throw around verbiage of defending the motherland. War, though, is an entirely different matter. Does China want war?
I would say definitely not. If you look at, China has really one or two military bases outside China. All of their military has been based on what they call anti-access, anti-denial. So it's basically protecting their own coastline. Obviously, they are geared to take Taiwan if they have to. They are now being forced, though, to go more of what, blue water navy. They are being forced to go internationally, protect those oil, protect the oil flows into China and the raw material flows into China. But before the last few years, they have been. You'd have to go back to the Vietnam War of '79, where they had any conflicts with neighbors, and then before that, maybe on the Indian border, like 1962. But beyond that, very little military activity. Now, with that being said, it's easy to say you're a pacifist when you have no clause. China wasn't in a position ever to go outside their borders and fight anybody. They were mostly concerned with internal stability. Now, though, you're seeing China has become an economic juggernaut, and they are becoming more of a global superpower. Their navy is now has about 350 surface combat vessels. The United States Navy has 290. So their navy is now, and the rate at what they can put out new military equipment is like scaring the hell out of people in the Pentagon, because we don't have that kind of economic capacity anymore. It's like World War II, but now China's America, where they can just overwhelm you with material military force, and we can't build. It takes us. We spent $1 trillion on the F-35 before one plane rolled off the line. It's just a cultural degeneration that's hit the industrial base. It's just hit society, and it's hit the military. And I think even with this latest Afghanistan stuff, people are starting waking up and going, what's going on? We thought the U.S. military was so supreme. That's going to lead to the end of the dollar. So by 2030, we're going to see a fiat U.S. dollar collapse is my expectation. But China in the past has not, to finish off the question, China has not been aggressive at all internationally in the past. Will that remain so in the future? We'll see. Probably not, but time will tell. So.
Okay, let me turn the tables. A little bit of a tough question here, but do you think the U.S. wants war, or at least what would be the reasons for these two nations to go to war?
So the China. So a lot of people will refer to the Thucydides trap, where the rising power always gets in a conflict with the current power. The United States, we're looking at, if you combine the English Empire with the American Empire, we're looking at, kind of an Anglo-Saxon dominated world with the Russians for 3, 4, 500 years now. So that's quickly becoming to an end. China is already the big 800-pound gorilla of the global economy. They're going to be the 800-pound gorilla of the military. They're very aggressive in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, claiming most of that territory. A lot of the Asian countries are upset about it. Vietnam, obviously Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines. The U.S. is using this group. They're using what's called the Quad, so Japan, Australia, U.S., India, as kind of a counterbalance to China. What's interesting though is you basically need this Quad just to try to match China's military might in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. It's not that this U.S. is so much more dominant. They're not. So what could we're seeing the last few years just a lot more belligerence. The U.S. The China has built up the islands in the South China Sea. They have full command and control now. They have military air bases on it. They have missiles on it. China has what they call the Dongfeng 41s that can hit anything all the way to Guam and just sink it. So the U.S. military really can't defend Taiwan. What would cause a war between the two? You got a miscalculation. You've got potential China-Japan conflict. I mean, China has not forgotten about World War II. They lost 35 million people. And if you live in China, as I have, you see just the constant hatred of Japan that's been built up. I mean, it's even in kids' cartoons about Kong Roo, resist Japan. And so there's all types of flashpoints out there. Obviously, the current ones are Taiwan and the South China Sea.
Okay, yeah. Speaking about the South China Seas, many countries in ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they sit right in China's backyard and potentially can be influenced, potentially could be dominated should China choose to do so. But should countries in ASEAN, such as Singapore, where I currently am, have anything to fear as China becomes a global dominating force?
I would say not fear. I would say the issues with the ASEAN, Singapore, is you're going to have to balance these two powers. So most of the world are going to fall into a U.S. orbit or a China orbit, and I don't see how that relationship is mended at this point. So being over in Asia, the power of the Chinese economy. I mean, people in Thailand and Cambodia or wherever, their export market is going to be China now, and they're going to import a ton of stuff from China. Their largest trading partner is going to be China. Even people that are have big rivalries with China, like Japan, their largest trading partner has become China. It's past the U.S. You look at a country like South Korea, they're now selling so much more into China than they are the United States. So there's a lot of these countries are going to say, hey, what's good for our business? We can't just get rid of China. And nobody can at this point. You're economically locked in. Same with Taiwan. I mean, 10% of the Taiwanese population lives in mainland China. You had Taiwanese factories or companies. They'd have one factory in Taiwan, and they'd build 20 in mainland China. So their whole business is become mainland China and intertwine with that, even though they want to keep themselves as a separate country. So ASEAN will have this kind of interplay between balancing these two superpowers, and I think long term economically, probably going to be continued forced into the orbit of China.
Dan, would you say that the Western governments and organizations such as the World Trade Organization allowed China to rise, or did China rise in part on the faults of misdeeds of Western governments, or simply put, did China rise on its own?
Well, China rose themselves. China rose themselves. You can't. Obviously, the U.S. helped with technology transfers. As I mentioned, when I first started out, one of my jobs was to go out to all these new factories that we'd purchased. We purchased like 4 or 5 in one year, and they were so backwards. They would have 7 times the number of people they needed, couldn't really make anything, didn't understand engineering tolerances. It was basically they were 40 years behind in manufacturing. Within that 20 years, they caught up and surpassed the U.S. So China rose themselves. It's basically been a lot of, you know, as blood, sweat, and tears, hard work, building out the factories. The government has created. I'd always like to say the Chinese economic miracle was created by the Chinese people, not so much the government. The government screwed up a lot of things. The government, I will give them credit that they created the special economic zones. They created kind of the fish tank where the fish could swim and took the boot off the peasants, and the Chinese people just ran with it and created an economic miracle. Now we're moving into more of a uncertain future where the government's taking so much more control and meddling into the economy that they could kill the golden goose that lays that golden eggs. That is a potential. They need to be very careful about it. But China's risen on themselves. Obviously, they've imported the technology, they've imported capital, but now they're the world's largest creditor. They're the world's largest economy. They're the world's largest everything. 50% of everything is in China. So 50% of all the raw materials are bought in China. They're 70% of chip consumption. They're an import powerhouse. Not a lot of people realize they import, trillions of dollars of imports. They're a massive consumption economy as well. So they've risen themselves. The U.S. has been, I would lay blame at the Western government, especially the U.S., at their feet by not understanding the economics and letting themselves get deindustrialized.
Okay, that's a great point there. You mentioned China's the leader of is at the top when it comes to the economy, apex economy. Wouldn't apex economy want to use another country's currency to trade or to hold as a world's reserve currency? And we kind of touched on the dollar dying out.
Yeah, so the plans with the China has always pegged the renminbi against the dollar. They do that for stability. If you look at how unstable the current Bretton Woods system is with the currency fluctuations, imagine you run a factory and you're exporting, half of your product. This week you're making 10%, next week you're losing 10%. It makes no sense. With the current rapid currency fluctuations, it made no sense. China pegged their renminbi against the dollar so that they can make it very stable. And that was the target export market. Originally was the US. Now only about 20% of their exports go to the United States. So that won't be where it ends, though. China has basically kept the RMB not convertible, which is kind of insane considering it's the world's second largest economy. You go down the next 20 countries, all have convertible currencies. So China has kept that locked up. They let it filter through Hong Kong, Singapore a bit, let some leakage out with, different quotas, currency convertible quotas and things. But China's obviously, they're going to go to the digital RMB. That's their thought process. They have been heavy gold and silver. So, I was buying gold and silver 20 years ago in China. You can find gold everywhere. Every banking system, every bank, retail branch. You go to small cities, they have a little gold window. So like little gold product, gold bars, coins that they sell. They will call that keeping gold with the people. So if you look at the Chinese central bank gold reserves, didn't change for a long time, and they actually kept it secret. But they were trying to for a long time push gold out to the people. Now they're looking at a new digital RMB, which is a whole nother topic, which kind of utilizes the concept of Bitcoin or the blockchain as a way to get money out to people. They're doing the test runs all over China now. People have digital RMB wallets. Will that be accepted in the long run as stable? Who knows? It probably will work well in China. I couldn't imagine it doesn't. But will it be accepted outside China? I think China's kind of, once again, it's a governance model. They just decide they're going to do something and they do it. They move so fast. Whereas the Federal Reserve I think, came out with a 7-page white paper on it. It took them a year and a half. So, that's where they're going. I think on the monetary side with currencies is they're definitely looking at a digital RMB at this point.
Okay. Dan, does China want to dominate the world? I mean, if not politically, economically. I mean, using economic domination as a soft way to gain political, geopolitical, global domination. So is that world domination something that's on China's mind?
Yeah, I think definitely they want the export markets, but a lot of their policies maybe look like world domination, but they're just reactive to the global environment. So take the One Belt, One Road. What is that really about? That's really about getting Middle Eastern oil supplies over land into China. So they've got a pipeline already from Iran to Pakistan. The oil pipeline now is in plan from Pakistan to Afghanistan and into China to get all that Middle Eastern oil over land. But why do they do that? Is because for decades, the United States, we sit back and think, China can't beat us. We'll just cut off their oil supplies at the Straits of Malacca, their ocean-borne oil supply. We'll just cut that off, and we win. So China builds a one belt and one road to go around it. So a lot of this is reactive policy to kind of to the global environment. In terms of trying to dominate the globe, I don't really see that militarily. China, if you look at their history, they are very sensitive to countries meddling in their foreign affairs. Right? Go back pre-World War II, seven nations invaded China. As I mentioned before, Japan killed 35 million people, took over the northeast of the country, literally sent 500,000 Japanese settlers into northeast China to take over the farms. Like they were, the other nations, they're in the middle of a civil war. So they are very, China will always say, we do not plan to meddle in foreign countries' affairs. And that's why they'll go get the contracts in Africa, or the dictators in charge. They don't care. Long as we can build you a road to the mine and get the goods out and pay you the money, we'll build a few schools for you and electrical power plants and all this other stuff. Kind of a win-win situation, but it's not a military backed. I mean, if you're going to say anybody's over the top on the military, it's the US. I mean, we have hundreds of bases out there, constant meddling. And what do we get for it? For the last 30, 40 years, it's just we create failed states and we create refugees everywhere we go into these countries. And it's basically a out of control system at this point.
Dan, in your view, how does the world look when, let's say, China transitions to the steering wheel and the U.S. transitions to the back seat, or maybe might have to take an Uber instead of being allowed to ride in the car?
Right. Yeah, it's something everyone will have to pivot to. I think it's basically already happened. So, I mean, if you look at the global economic space, China is bigger than U.S. Officially it's a bigger on a PPP basis, GDP. On a regular basis, about 15 trillion now. U.S. about 21 trillion. But there's so much fluff in U.S. GDP numbers. On we had to keep our GDP at 21. We printed $11 trillion last year during COVID. 11 trillion. The deficits are out of control. There's no end in sight. It's 3, 4, 5 trillion a year. Just go back to TARP in 2008, 2009 financial crisis. The world was shocked when we printed 700 billion. Everybody's shocked. Oh my God, 700 billion. Now we're at 11 trillion. This all goes exponential. The next printing will top 20 trillion. So we're coming to what I call a 2030 endpoint where you're not going to be able to value anything in US dollar. It's confetti at this point. People say, what's going to be the price of Bitcoin? What's going to be the price of gold? What's going to be the price of silver? How do you even value it in a fiat currency that's destroyed? By 2030, there won't be any. You won't be able to value it. We'll be on a whole different paradigm. So that's where I see the world going, unfortunately.
Okay, last question here. What are some things that the West can learn from China and China can learn from the West?
Yeah, U.S. I mean, what we could learn from China is on the manufacturing space. Every time China tries to in free markets, believe it or not, every time China tries to boost their economy, they implement some new free market reform measure. So they started with the special economic zones, no taxes, and that's what the U.S. should look at. Go to Detroit, go to Baltimore, go to these bombed out cities and create a special economic zone. You create a factory, no taxes. You can make these places boom, but you got to you've also got to steer the economy, and U.S. has been doing this the last few years. It's like, look, if you have a 50% duty against us, we're going to have a 50% duty against you. For 20, 30 years, we just let that go on. We would import, the same product line, you could export 40% duty in China, 2% US. That's a prescription to deindustrialize yourself. So US I think they've woken up a little bit on this in this area. But they've got to get back to manufacturing. You can make the U.S. economy boom if you get back to manufacturing. All these social problems that the U.S. has, the drugs, the violence, All of this is corrected if people have decent jobs. So you've seen the economic indicator. As soon as the economic indicators in the U.S. started going downhill, say the '80s, late '80s, all the social problems skyrocketed. So they're never going to fix themselves unless they can get back to off the money printing and actually building real prosperity for themselves in the U.S.
Okay, but if they went back to manufacturing, could we even compete in manufacturing anymore?
So you have to look at different product lines. Do you want to make, do you want to make little plastic widgets? You don't really need to. The problem is, what does China export to US? Solar panels, computers, every type of high-end product, even machinery. US has no merchant marine anymore. We don't make ships. We don't have ships. Those are all Chinese owned and European owned, going back and forth. We don't have a machine tool industry. It's largely German and Japanese. We don't have, as I mentioned, the car industry. It's about 12 million. Most of that, half of it's imported vehicles. You know how many jobs are linked with the car industry? It's insane. I mean, like every part you import, there's 500 jobs linked with it. Product line after product line, everything is outsourced and imported. The few areas where U.S. has excelled is in software, in the world of bits, not atoms. You need to start looking at the power systems. I mean, the infrastructure, everything in U.S. is rotting right now. It's all decades and decades old. And obviously, living in Asia, if you fit around Asia, you go to U.S., you're just like, you feel like you're stepping back in time, like you've literally gone back 20 or 30 years. And I don't think people can grasp that. In the U.S., we're like frogs in boiling water. We just don't realize the temperature is going up and up and up. And so infrastructure, however, the U.S. government is almost impotent in this type of stuff. We're going to pass an infrastructure plan. 10% of it goes to infrastructure, 90% handouts to stupid programs. So there's a whole area where the U.S. government needs to probably need to cut themselves in half right now, get rid of half of the government people in D.C. and start over.
Hear you. Dan Collins, before we wrap up, can you tell our viewers how they can find more of your work and the projects that you're working on?
Sure, you could find me, mainly find me on Twitter at Dan Collins 2011. Mainly, I interact with some people there through Twitter.
All right, Dan, we thank you for
Yep.
your time, and I look forward to visiting again with you soon.
All right. Thanks, Patrick.
That was Dan Collins, a certified ethical hacker and a man well versed in the economics and opportunities that are available in China. To see more of Dan's work, please visit hippogriff.tech and follow his tweets at DanCollins2011. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the SBTV channel. Audio-only versions can be found on iTunes and Spotify.